For decades, the corporate workplace saw only a few generations actively working together simultaneously. The influx of millennials and increasingly Gen Z, however, has ushered in new workplace dynamics for leaders to navigate.
There's a change or shift in the temporal dynamic around rewards and recognition from a generational perspective. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to someone who's a millennial or Gen Z employee, and they're baffled why they didn't get the promotion and why they have to repeat mastery.
That's Dr. Candace Steele Flippin, an expert on the multi-generational workforce. Since 2016, Candace has been a research fellow at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. She uses her unique background as a communication executive, researcher, and author to provide practical career insights on the future of the multi-generational workplace. She's been featured on Forbes, CNBC, CBS, and Today.com, and has been named one of the most influential Black executives in corporate America by Savoy magazine. In addition, Candace is a Senior Vice President and Chief Communication Officer at Acuity Brands. Acuity is a leading industrial technology company based in Atlanta, Georgia. She's an accomplished communication executive widely recognized for her transformational leadership in the industrial, financial services, medical device, biotech, and pharmaceutical industries. Candace earned her Doctor of Management at Case Western Reserve University, her MBA from Johns Hopkins University, and her BA from the University of Michigan.
And as I've advanced my research, I'm seeing a new theme emerge, and that's around the need for empathy in the workplace, and empathy particularly in communications.
I'm Maril, MacDonald, and my passion is helping people and organizations navigate the human struggle of change. I believe that when we relinquish control, we open up amazing new possibilities. This podcast, Let Go and Lead, is about what happens when we loosen the reins. In it, I speak with business leaders, academics, and creative thinkers to hear about their career and life journeys and to gather what they've learned about change, transformation, and creativity along the way. And now, Dr. Candace Steele Flippin. Thank you so much, Candace, for joining the Let Go and Lead family.
Hey, Maril, thank you so much for inviting me to participate today.
I love that you define yourself as a workforce scholar. What does that mean?
In my context, it means that as a communicator, I spent the better part of my career helping companies message to a broad group of stakeholders, both internally and externally. And I started to notice probably about 15 years ago how the communications dynamics were changing. And I just saw an intersection in terms of what I was doing as a communicator and culture and how I could help. And so I went back to get my doctorate so that I could understand these management dynamics better so that I can contribute to the conversation in a more holistic way. And so when I talk about the dynamics of the workforce, I'm looking at it through the lens of my expertise as a communicator and what are some of the ways that we are messaging and communicating among our changing workforce age dynamic that can make workplaces more productive, more engaging, and more meaningful to our employees.
How about we start with a few things you think we should all know about multi-generational workforces?
Well, the first thing that everyone should know is that it's a great thing. Studies show that the more diverse your employee population is and the more diverse your leader makeup is, the better it is for your business. You bring diversity of thinking, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, and that leads to more creativity and innovation. So it's a great thing. The other thing is it's already happening, and it's been happening for a long time. And many workplaces are looking up and they're seeing that already that there are 4, maybe 5 different generation groups in their workplace already. So we're not going back. And so it's a good time to embrace it.
I think it's interesting because for a while it was sort of an anomaly in corporate America, but really family farms had multi-generational workforces always, right?
That's true.
And you think about how everybody pulled together and passed things on from one generation to another and supported one another. So I think it's really terrific to see it in corporate America.
I agree. And it's also exciting to know that we can learn and grow from one another. And that's what my research is all about, creating opportunity that the diversity of the workplace brings to us.
And what do you think right now is unique about this point in history when it comes to the makeup of the workforce?
Well, there are two insights I have on that. The first is just the reality is that mainly most workforces are now mainly millennial in scope. Some of them have upwards of 35 to 40 or 50% of millennials or Gen Z in their workforce. And it probably for most seemed overnight. So we're already there. And with the pandemic, we're now having to be more intentional about what our workplaces look like. I was looking at an article a few months ago from AARP, and they reported that over 2 million people over 55 have already left the workforce permanently. So those are baby boomers who are no longer in the workforce. And there's been a lot of discussion about how women have been adversely impacted by the pandemic. So they have caregiver opportunities. Maybe they're rethinking what they're doing because of the pandemic. And so now we have these displaced workers. And so what we now have to think about the makeup is that there are less older folks and maybe even more older folks over 55 in the workplace. And then also too, women who are starting to accelerate in some places may now have different workplace considerations. So it's become a really interesting place because there was so much momentum. And now over the next couple of years, it may balance out as we think about the impacts of the pandemic.
And as you're thinking about the workforce, and we just talked about the fact that now many companies have 5 generations, it sounds like what you're saying is that's not going to be the case for much longer as the baby boomers all retire. And of course, we had traditionalists, right? Like people over 65 or whatever in the workforce for some period of time as well.
There's a lot of speculation that by the year 2030, which is right around the corner, that people who are able to retire may retire from their primary roles. And the pandemic could be an accelerator to that. So yes, there will be more younger workers in the workforce. And just in terms of population size, there are less Gen Xs, which is my generation, than millennials or Gen Z. So you're going to see a much younger workforce population. Having said that, there are many people who are baby boomers and traditionalists who will keep working. Perhaps some of them will extend their primary careers, but others will go off and do other things, start their own businesses, perhaps do things in a different type of work capacity, perhaps part-time or something where they have a different level of responsibility. But all in all, we'll start to see a younger workforce.
And what do you actually see as the ramifications of that? And let me ask you too, will we see a younger workforce than we've seen in past, or just a younger workforce than we're seeing right now?
So there are a couple of things that I think play into that. One is just population size. How many workers are there available to work? And the baby boomers itself were a large population group, much larger than Gen X, which followed. And then millennials are much larger than Gen X. So just by looking at numbers, I think you're going to see a larger workforce because of the size of the workforce. The note about people retiring at 55, I think, is also shifting. A lot of workers go on to do a second act. So maybe they will stay in their primary roles less and go do something completely different. So I think the makeup of the workforce will shift a little bit, but as people work longer. But in terms of absolute numbers, we'd have to just see the impacts of the pandemic. And then we are also seeing this emergence of the gig worker, where people are defining entrepreneurism on their own and other ways for them to make money. And so it's going to be interesting. What I will say is there'll be less baby boomers for sure.
Let's talk for a minute about the gig workers. Are you seeing that as a generational issue or connection, I guess would be the better way to ask that?
I honestly don't have the numbers on the age breakdown of the gig workers. I will say from my research that it is attractive for people who want to supplement their income at all life stages, and particularly attractive in my research from the millennial and Gen Z perspective because they feel it gives them more autonomy and less pressure in terms of being in a traditional, what they perceive to be a traditional corporate structure.
This kind of brings us to my next question, which is around the generational related values. I know you've done a lot of research around this and what each of the generations actually value and in what rank order. And I found this fascinating because I think some of your findings might surprise people.
They surprised me. Honestly, when I started my first study around generational values, I was really trying to separate the discussion from stereotypes, which are not helpful and are limiting, to actually what people value, because what you value show up in your behaviors. And so at the time that I started this research, there was a lot of discussion around millennials wanting better work-life balance. And I did a number of interviews and focus groups to try to understand what are the values and themes from a professional perspective that each generation was looking at. And the themes that emerged were performance, doing well in your role, getting more money, having work-life balance, getting a promotion, changing careers, or sunsetting your career into retirement. And when I asked each generation group to rank this group of 6, 3 came to the top: performance, making more money, which varied by generation in terms of the number 1 and number 2 position. But what was interesting to me is that Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, and Baby Boomer workers ranked work-life balance 3rd on the list. And that was a surprise to me. When I probed on it for the younger generations, they seemed to understand that given their profession, and these were all working adults, that they would have to pay their dues, some of them said, put in the hours, work more hours to prove themselves. And so it was really about having an environment where they could choose the work-life balance they needed given their life and their goals.
Yeah, it surprised me because we do so often hear that millennials prize work-life balance first. And it makes sense, right? Because they're all now at that stage in life where they're having families, want to buy a house. So things are important.
Yeah, a lot of people don't quite understand or realize or recognize that millennials are 40 now. And, they're coming midlife in their adulthood. And so they're thinking about things a little bit differently. But even at the start of their careers, it's really important that employers recognize that work-life balance, while great, is not a substitute for fair compensation or professional development.
When you asked about performance, what was the definition of performance?
Doing well in my current role.
Yeah, I think those are all good reminders for leaders because they're in many ways interrelated, right? Almost from a safety and security standpoint, and kind of a psychological safety that I'm doing well. I can pay my bills. I can balance my life.
I agree. And, you've been bringing up the topic of psychological safety within organizations, and I believe it's a really important one. When I talk to millennials in my research, quite often in interviews, they will say that one of the things that they're proud of in their generation is that they take their mental health and wellness seriously from a professional perspective. Where if you think about the generations before them, it wasn't considered politically correct to bring your wellness or mental health issues into the workplace in terms of the need for space and time and a chance to unwind and recharge. And so it's actually really important. And as I've advanced my research, I'm seeing a new theme emerge, and that's around the need for empathy in the workplace, and empathy particularly in communications.
I'm so believer in empathy, but it seems like COVID suddenly made it a trend, which is a good thing, right? I think there have been just a lot of things now that leaders have come to recognize that I guess, were ignoring in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure when or why bringing your whole self to work became what was expected, but I'm relieved to know that it's becoming more and more welcome in the workplace because it's leading to people just being able to be their authentic selves.
And what have you seen now with all the discussions around COVID and what has possibly changed and things companies want to make sure they continue to take forward? What would be your recommendation from a communication and workforce scholar standpoint?
I have three recommendations. The first has to do with just our interpersonal communications. I studied 12 different dimensions of interpersonal communications. That's the way you exchange information and ideas both verbally and non-verbally. And I had a study of about 1,400 individuals from the four generation groups, baby boomers, Gen X, Millennial, and Gen Z. And I wanted to understand which of the different aspects of interpersonal communications resonated with each generation group as a proxy for how they want to be communicated with and how they normally communicate. And what I learned is that baby boomers resonate towards active listening, paying attention to each other, knowing that when they're having a conversation, the other person on the other end is demonstrating that they are hearing what the person is saying. Gen X resonated towards collaborating, working together in groups, teamwork, and millennials and Gen Z workers resonated to showing understanding for others and empathy. And so what I'm hoping has come out of this pandemic and what I'm talking about is if companies are training leaders and their employees around effective listening skills, working together from a collaborative fashion, and demonstrating empathy, they have a better opportunity for multi-generational workplace dynamics. The other aspect of what I've come to appreciate more since the pandemic is the need to make sure that we're thinking holistically about how work takes place and where work takes place in the future. And what I mean by that is when I started my career, there was this whole notion of butts and seats. And I'm doing air quotes where you have to be in your office for a rigid set of time frames and what that meant. And in some environments, whenever the discussion would emerge around the need to work remote or have flexible schedules, it was a non-starter in some cases. Well, the pandemic has changed all of that. And what I'm hoping is that employers will take a look at how their workplace needs to move forward for it to be productive through the lens of what workers need, particularly as we think about in some geographies, maybe the city will be completely open. In others, maybe it'll continue to be a hybrid. We may see spikes on and off of COVID cases flaring up. And what does that mean in terms of your workers? So what I'm hoping is that our benefits for workers will change and grow, which will allow for people to have even more holistic lives. And I think that's going to make us more productive as organizations and as a society.
What are some of the benefits you're thinking about when you say that?
The best example I can give you is one in our own workplace here at Acuity Brands. We've looked at the pandemic and we decided coming out of the pandemic that we were going to be a stronger, better organization. And so through the pandemic, we've adopted what we're calling Acuity Anywhere. And what we're looking to do is take away rigid rules around when and where work takes place to really look at how work can take place in a way that's productive for our employees and beneficial. And so we've divided our workforce into three different types of workers: those who need to be on site, maybe for manufacturing, but then we've looked at how we give them time away from work. We've looked at a hybrid situation where there's some employees who may need to come together to collaborate on teams, and what do the workplaces need to be like to accommodate those. And then we've looked at our workforce for those who are now going to be 100% remote and trying to come up with ways to accommodate setting up a permanent home office situation for those employees. And so we've now, opened our walls, so to speak, and our employees are really excited about it. Now, having said that, we still need to think about engagement and culture. We still need to think about connectivity with our workplace, particularly around the younger generations who may have never had this opportunity and they're coming into a new environment. And so they want to make sure that they are connected to their culture and their leaders. And then the other thing that I'll say is I've been tracking worker attitudes throughout the pandemic. And I did a global study in Europe, Canada, and the United States. And I wanted to get a sense of what workers needed. And it was interesting. I found that, while a lot of workers are happy to stay home and want to stay home, there is a subset of workers who actually want to come back in the office. And they want to know that it's going to be safe. And so that there are heightened expectations around safety hygiene that employers will probably need to look at that probably wasn't a part of their maintenance routine pre-pandemic.
The other one I'm really hoping this will change is that people will really stay home when they're sick. That's always been, as a leader, one of the most difficult things to encourage people: stay home.
Yes.
What are some other things with the employee experience that leaders should really be cognizant of?
Trying to make sure that you're recreating those in-person recognition experiences and rewards that took place, whether they were formal or informal when you were all together. And now that you're experiencing your colleagues in a two-dimensional type experience, that you keep those going, because those are really important and valued just as much. The other thing is to really focus on training and development. Employees still want to know that they're going to be trained and developed. They also want to know that they have longevity with their employees. So to the extent that you can, reassuring them about the solvency of your organization, and then also that you keep some type of routine of what was happening before. So if there were quarterly or biannual reviews and check-ins, that those are still happening so that folks can really look at having normalcy.
You know, Candace, it's interesting you brought up longevity, and that actually made me think of another question, which is how quickly people switch jobs. What are you seeing in your research? Is that really true that the younger generations want to keep moving every couple of years?
So it's mixed. Whenever I ask in my research, do you intend to stay with your current job, or how long do you intend to stay? There's a good 30% or more who have expressed intent to stay. So that's one thing. But if you go back to looking at values, what was in the top two: doing well in my job and making more money. And so what I've seen is a number of employers talk about freedoms around time off. And time off, again, is great, but it doesn't trump development or pay. And those are the top two professional values. And when I talk to Millennials and Gen Z about why they plan to leave in the first year or under a year, many of them say there's no development, there's no progression, which leads me to believe that those expectations are not being met. The other thing that I like to talk about is there's a change or shift in the temporal dynamic around rewards and recognition from a generational perspective. A lot of Gen X and baby boomers will say, well, these younger workers come in and after 6 months or a year, they want a promotion, they want a raise, they're going to change jobs. But if you think about how technology has enabled our society, it's also changed expectations around how long things should take. And a great example I like to use is around gaming. So imagine if you're playing a game and the game has levels. You progress from level 1, 2, 3, 4, 100, however many levels there are. In the context of people who grew up in a gaming environment, if it takes you one time or 10 times to advance to the next level, the minute you achieve that level, you go to the next level. It's not, I have to do it for 2 years. It's not, I have to do it for 20 times. The minute you advance, the minute you solve it, you advance. And so what that has done for a younger generation is it embeds this mindset that if I check the box, I get to move on. And technology also enables me to do things quickly. So having time-bound expectations don't make sense to them. And I suspect there's a tension between what it means to advance and make more money by generation group, and a discussion really doesn't take place. And I would encourage employers to be very clear about the development plans and succession plans and promotional timelines, and being very clear about what it means and then backing it up. And if it's not possible, being transparent.
That's really interesting because I think about all the research we grew up with, which is it takes 10,000 hours to master something, which is, I heard you talking, that's a time-bound concept.
Yes. So it's time bound. So those temporal expectations don't apply where, it's really different. Like if I can get it on the first time, I'm ready to go to the next one. And I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to someone who's a millennial or Gen Z employee, and they're baffled why they didn't get the promotion and why they have to repeat mastery over and over and over again when one should be sufficient.
As we were talking about work-life balance earlier, is there a difference in the way the generations describe it? Or is that more related to one's personal circumstances?
It's really one's personal circumstance based on life stage and why you may need it and what you're going through. And I will say, again, all the generations value work-life balance. It was just third.
Right, right.
And it wasn't lower for Gen X or baby boomers. It was third across the board. And so what that tells me is the ability to balance your work obligations and your life obligations are meaningful, more so than changing a career, more so than retirement and other things. It's just that where you are in your career and in your life, it may mean different things. And it was even more important than a promotion.
That's kind of interesting too, because a promotion brings more money, right?
Well, making more money was up there.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Maybe it's more the status of the promotion is what they're referring to there versus the money.
Yeah. When I talk about personal values in my research, relationships are usually one or two. And so I suspect that in the work-life balance is the ability to be able to manage your relationships.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit earlier about psychological safety. Is that defined differently by generations?
Honestly, Maril, I haven't explored psychological safety as much in my research, so I can't answer that. The best that I could say is that I see psychological safety as a more gender-related construct as it comes through in terms of mental health and well-being, and where women talk about it more than men.
Oh, that's interesting. I know you said you haven't researched it a lot, but I'd just love to get the advantage of anything you have learned.
So the only anecdote that I can touch upon as it relates to communication is just the whole notion that Gen Z and millennial workers prefer empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes out of the different interpersonal communication skill set. So what that tells me is, the emotional nature of how you relate to someone and thinking about them as a whole person and what that means probably correlates to the environment that they're operating in. So if the environment is safe enough where they can, be vulnerable, they can be their whole self, which is very different than the baby boomers who are focused on, paying attention to what I'm saying to you, and Gen X who, are focused on teamwork and collaboration, so the task orientation. And the only other thing that I could say about that based on my research is if you think about the way traditionalists came into the workplace and the values that they instilled on baby boomers, it was really more of a command and control type of construct. Do what you say, don't ask questions, don't question. And then we saw the emergence of these cross-functional teams and these global teams that, Gen X kind of grew up in, and then technology enhanced our ability to break borders and those sorts of things. But touching on the emotional aspect of what was going on with the worker is really a newer construct. It's something new that people are talking about. And it's something that I'm now seeing that the younger generations are embracing. And from a communications perspective, what that's going to mean in terms of how organizations communicate, it has to do with the tone, so that corporate speak doesn't resonate with younger workers or is less accepted by younger workers. Making sure that you're speaking to them as individuals is important, and that the tone also has some type of humanistic aspect to it, so that people feel that they belong and that they are in an environment where they can bring their whole self, which I can then translate to a safe environment.
No, it totally makes sense. And, it's interesting what you're describing. You would think it's what everybody wants.
Well, certainly everyone's benefiting from the perceived demands that the millennials have put on the workplace. A lot of the benefits changes have come about because companies want to be more competitive to these younger workers who have, different expectations. So we're certainly benefiting from it.
Generally speaking, what do you think we can do to close the gap between the generations and really get the best out of each as they work together?
I don't think we have to close the gap. Generational theory says when and where you were born and what was happening historically shapes what's important to you. So if you came of age when everything was technologically accessible to you, then you're going to leverage technology and appreciate speed and efficiency. If you were growing up, during a time of, a Great Depression where resources were limited, you would value not wasting things. And so you bring all of those values to you at the workplace. And so I don't think we have to in any way diminish them. I say that as each generation comes into its own, society grows and gets better because of it. What I would recommend is that we think about our biases and try to increase our own self-awareness about how bias, whether it's we perceive it to be positive or negative, affects our decision-making and our judgment. And really just try to listen, work together, and be empathetic when we communicate.
That's terrific. And what do you see that's most important in the traits of a leader?
Well, based on my research, it looks like empathy is rising to the top.
Yeah. And all the things that go with it, right?
Yes.
Active listening and really.
Yeah. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes and being open to how they may react to something and being curious as to why, even if it's different than how you might have reacted or thought about it.
And what do you think leaders need most to let go of?
Bias, really increasing our self-awareness and just recognizing that we all carry implicit bias. And what steps do we need to take to make sure that we're creating places where the talent that you want to walk in and remain in the door is working in an environment under your leadership or alongside of you in your leadership to do their best job each and every day. The best thing that anyone can do is to think about how they're interacting with folks who are not like them. So if you're a baby boomer, make sure you're mentoring someone from a different generation. If you're a millennial, reach out and mentor someone, whether they are younger or older than you. There's a lot of benefit both ways. And instead of thinking about how the different generations may be perceived to clash in the work environment, be open to see how they can, by working together, improve the work environment.
Well, Candace, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Let's review what we learned from Candace's research findings and her insights on connecting with people based on their generational values. First, technology has changed younger workers' expectations about the amount of time it takes to advance in their career. Take, for example, colleagues who grew up playing video games. Many of these workers expect to be promoted to the next level as soon as they prove they can handle a particular task well, and not a moment later. This shift in temporal expectations is seen mostly among millennials and Gen Z. It's a notable change from the view of Gen X and baby boomers, who may expect advancement only after proving their mastery time and time again. Second, the need for work-life balance appears to be relative to one's life stage. In Candace's research, all generations ranked work-life balance third, below performance and higher compensation, on a list of 6 values. The ranking may be surprising to some leaders because they have the perception that younger generations aren't willing to work hard. That's not true. Candace's research reveals that all workers understand the importance of hard work, but younger workers in particular want flexibility in how they do it. It's also important to realize that work-life balance isn't a substitute for proper compensation or professional development. Third, younger workers are proud to take mental health and well-being very seriously. They value time to recharge and unwind, whereas older colleagues may view bringing personal needs into the workplace as politically incorrect. In addition, the emphasis on authenticity is driving workplace experiences that encourage people to bring your whole self to work. Fourth, interpersonal communication approaches should take into consideration the values that each generation prizes to be most effective. So as you build relationships with colleagues or seek to impact the experiences fostered in your multi-generational workplace, keep this in mind. 1. Baby boomers prefer to see people actively listening. 2. Gen X finds collaboration and teamwork incredibly valuable. And 3. Millennials and Gen Z gravitate toward expressions of empathy for others. And last and most important, we must realize that each generation, as it comes into its own, makes our society better, Candace says. This means we must stay cognizant of our own generation's biases and perceptions. We must also be more self-aware when making decisions or exercising judgment that affect others. Thank you, Candace, for this eye-opening conversation about the generations in our workforce. Until next time, this is Let Go and Lead.